When 300 Japanese aircraft filled the skies over Burma with the sole purpose of destroying a single American pilot, survival seemed impossible. Yet what unfolded in the tropical sky above Rangoon on January 23, 1942, would defy every law of aerial combat and become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of the Pacific War. Flight Officer Robert Bob Scott of the American volunteer group the legendary Flying Tigers found himself utterly alone. His P-40 Warhawk bearing the iconic shark-tooth nose art was the only thing standing between him and certain death. The radio crackled with desperate warnings from the ground. Every Jap plane in Burma is coming for you. Get out. Get out now. But Bob Scott wasn't getting out. Not yet. The American volunteer group had arrived in Burma just weeks earlier. A ragtag collection of former U.S. military pilots recruited by Claire Chennault to defend the Burma Road, China's last lifeline to the outside world. These men weren't official military personnel. They were mercenaries, paid $500 for every Japanese plane they shot down, fighting under Chinese colors before America had even entered the war. By January 1942, the situation had grown desperate. Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore was under siege. The Japanese juggernaut seemed unstoppable as it swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying speed. Rangoon, Burma's capital and vital port, stood as one of the last Allied strongholds in the region, and the Japanese High Command wanted it eliminated. Flight Officer Robert Scott was 23 years old, a Georgian farm boy with ice water in his veins and reflexes that had already earned him 3 confirmed kills. On the morning of January 23rd, he had volunteered for a routine reconnaissance mission photographing Japanese positions near Moulmein, 50 miles east of Rangoon. It should have been a simple 2-hour flight. His P-40 Billions Tomahawk was a beast of a machine, rugged, heavily armored, with 650 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings. The shark-tooth grin painted on its nose had become the symbol of the Flying Tigers, designed to terrify enemy pilots. But the P-40 had weaknesses. It was slower than the Japanese Zero, less maneuverable, and it couldn't climb as fast. In a turning dogfight, a Zero would win every time. Scott knew this. Every Flying Tiger pilot knew this. Their tactics compensated: dive, shoot, climb, repeat. Never turn with a Zero. Never. Scott's mission began uneventfully. He took off from Mingle at an airfield at 830 hours, climbing into the clear morning sky. The monsoon season had ended, leaving brilliant blue skies, perfect visibility, but no clouds to hide in. His orders were specific: photograph the Japanese positions, note troop movements, and return with intelligence for the next bombing run. By 0945 hours, he had completed his photo reconnaissance and turned west toward home. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to make it back with reserve. The engine hummed smoothly, the familiar vibration of the Allison V1710 engine thrumming through the airframe. Then the radio exploded with frantic chatter. All Tigers, massive enemy formation inbound to Rangoon. Count exceeds 200 aircraft. All available pilots scramble immediately. Scott's blood ran cold. 200 aircraft. The Japanese were launching everything they had, and he was 60 miles away, alone, with a camera instead of extra ammunition. He pushed the throttle forward, coaxing every ounce of speed from the P-40. The Allison engine roared, propelling him westward at 320 miles per hour. If he could just reach Mingaladan before the Japanese arrived, he could land, refuel, and join the defense. But at 1,015 hours, he saw them. The sky to the west had turned black, not with storm clouds, but with aircraft. Wave after wave of Japanese bombers escorted by swarms of Zero fighters, forming an aerial armada that stretched for miles. Scott had never seen so many planes in one place. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. His mind raced through the mathematics of survival. The Japanese were between him and his airfield. Going around them would consume fuel he didn't have. Going through them was suicide. Going back was surrender. The radio crackled again, this time addressed directly to him. Scott, this is Mingaladan Tower. Japanese formation has spotted you. Repeat, they've spotted you. Multiple enemy fighters breaking formation and heading your direction. Scott looked over his shoulder. 6 silvery specks had detached from the main formation, sunlight glinting off their wings as they banked toward him. 6 Zeros, and they were faster. He had perhaps 90 seconds before they were in firing range. What happened next would require split-second decisions that would mean the difference between life and death. Scott threw the P-40 into a dive, trading altitude for speed. The airspeed indicator climbed 350, 370, 390 miles per hour. The control stick grew heavy in his hands as the aircraft approached its structural limits, the wings groaning under the stress. The first Zero opened fire at 1,019 hours. Tracer rounds arced past Scott's canopy, brilliant streaks of light that seemed to move in slow motion. He jinked right, then left, the heavy P-40 responding sluggishly. Another burst, this time closer. He felt the impacts as 20mm cannon shells struck his tail section, punching holes through the aluminum skin. But Scott had one advantage: diving speed. The P-40 could outdive anything the Japanese had. He pushed the nose down further, screaming toward the jungle canopy at terminal velocity. The altimeter unwound rapidly 8,000 feet. 6/4. The 6 Zeros followed, but they couldn't match his dive speed without risking structural failure. At 1,500 feet, Scott pulled back hard on the stick. The G-forces crushed him into his seat as the P-40 bottomed out just 300 feet above the treetops. Blood drained from his head, his vision tunneling as he fought to maintain consciousness. 2 of the pursuing Zeros, unable to pull out in time, augured straight into the jungle, exploding in massive fireballs. 4 Zeros remained. Scott leveled off, skimming the jungle at wave-top height, weaving between the occasional tall tree. At this altitude, the Zero's maneuverability advantage was neutralized. There was no room to turn. It became a race of pure speed and nerve. But the radio brought worse news, Scott. Be advised, main Japanese formation has now been alerted to your position. Intelligence estimates 30 to 40 fighters have broken off to intercept you. You are now the primary target. POS 30 to 40 had just become Scott's new reality. Within minutes, it would be worse. The 4 Zeros behind him maintained pursuit, taking pot shots whenever Scott's evasive maneuvers gave them an angle. His aircraft shuddered with each hit. Most rounds punched through the non-critical areas. But it was only a matter of time before something vital was struck. At 1,034 hours, Scott spotted a weather cell ahead, a lone rain cloud, dark and pregnant with moisture, an anomaly in the otherwise clear sky. It was perhaps 2 miles across, sitting like a gray fortress over the jungle. If he could reach it, he could disappear. He angled toward it. The Zeros, sensing his intention and increasing their fire. More hits. His left aileron was shredded, making the aircraft pull to one side. He compensated with rudder, fighting the controls. The cloud was close now, so close. Tracer fire intensified, crisscrossing around his canopy. Then he was in. The gray walls of the rain cloud swallowed him completely. Visibility dropped to 0. Scott immediately began a climbing turn, changing altitude and direction, knowing the Zeros had lost visual contact. For 30 seconds, he was invisible. He burst out the other side at 4,000 feet, 5 miles from where he'd entered. The 4 Zeros were still searching the area he'd left, confused and angry. But his relief lasted exactly 12 seconds. A voice on the radio, thick with static and fear. Scott, Jesus Christ, Scott radar, shows over 100 enemy aircraft converging on your last known position. They're organizing a search pattern. You need to get on the deck and run now. 100 had become the new number. The Japanese weren't just trying to kill him anymore. They were making an example. They were showing that no one escaped. By 1,045 hours, Bob Scott's situation had deteriorated from desperate to impossible. His fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, maybe 20 minutes of flight time remaining. His aircraft had taken dozens of hits, controls responding sluggishly, and oil pressure was beginning to fluctuate. The engine temperature gauge crept toward the red line, and the sky was full of Japanese. Everywhere he looked, he saw them. Zeros in groups of 4 and 6, crisscrossing the sky in search patterns. High above, bomber formations orbited like vultures, their crews watching the hunt unfold below. The radio had gone silent. The other flying tigers were engaged in their own desperate battle over Rangoon, outnumbered 5 to 1. Scott was completely, utterly alone. At 1,052 hours, a group of 8 Zeros spotted him. This time, there was no cloud to hide in, no altitude to trade for speed. He was at 2,000 feet with nowhere to go. The Zeros came at him from multiple angles, 2 from above, 3 from each side, perfectly coordinated. These weren't novice pilots. These were veterans, men who had flown combat over China for months, and they had him boxed. The first pass shredded his right wing, 20mm shells punching fist-sized holes in the metal. The second pass took out his radio. It died with a burst of static and sparks. He was now deaf to the outside world, fighting blind with no information and no hope of rescue. Scott did the only thing he could. He fought. Ignoring every rule of engagement, he threw the damaged P-40 into a climbing turn, pulling the stick into his gut. The G-forces were crushing, his vision graying out, but he brought the nose around and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, tracers reaching out to catch. A Zero that had made the mistake of following him into the turn gnawed the Japanese fighter, disintegrated, its pilot's overconfidence turning into a fatal error as 50 caliber rounds sawed through the lightweight airframe. The Zero's fuel tank exploded, scattering burning debris across the sky. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Scott's maneuver had bled away his speed, and now he was a sitting duck. The remaining 7 Zeros closed in like sharks, sensing blood. Scott's ammunition counter showed he had less than 10 seconds of fire remaining. Perhaps 200 rounds split across 6 guns that he had to make them count. At 1,056 hours, Scott made a decision that would later be called either brilliant or insane. Instead of trying to run, he turned directly into the enemy formation, charging head-on at the nearest Zero. The Japanese pilot, shocked by the audacity, hesitated for a split second, and that was enough. Scott opened fire at 300 yards, walking his tracers into the Zero's engine. The Japanese fighter's propeller exploded, and the aircraft snap-rolled into an uncontrollable spin. 2 kills. But his guns clicked empty. He was out of ammunition. The remaining 6 Zeros closed in for the kill, their pilots certain that the lone American was finished. They formed up in a line astern, preparing to take turns making firing passes, an execution formation designed to conserve ammunition while guaranteeing the kill. Scott had perhaps 60 seconds to live. His mind raced. The P-40 was tougher than a Zero, more heavily armored, designed to absorb punishment. But there were limits. A few more passes and something critical would fail. The engine would seize, the controls would separate, or a fuel tank would explode. He needed a miracle. At 1,058 hours, he got one, though not in the form he expected. In the distance, he spotted a massive smoke column rising from the jungle. One of the crashed Zeros from earlier had started a forest fire. The smoke pillar climbed thousands of feet, thick and black, an opaque wall that even the Japanese wouldn't dare enter at low level. Trees were exploding from the heat, creating a hellish updraft that could tear an aircraft apart. Scott turned toward it. The Zeros followed, still confident in their numerical superiority. They didn't understand what he was planning until it was too late. At 200 miles per hour, Scott plunged directly into the smoke column. The world turned black. Heat washed over his aircraft, the canopy too hot to touch. Turbulence threw him violently against his straps, the aircraft bucking like a wild horse. He had no instruments, no horizon, no sense of up or down. He was flying purely on instinct, making tiny corrections to the stick and rudder, feeling for the aircraft's attitude through the seat of his pants. For 45 seconds, he was inside hell itself. The 6 Zeros scattered, refusing to follow. They orbited the smoke column, waiting for him to emerge, or for wreckage to fall from the sky. Neither happened. Scott burst out of the smoke at 50 feet, heading west at maximum speed. His aircraft blackened with soot but still flying. The Zeros were nowhere in sight. They were on the other side of the smoke column, still waiting. He had bought himself perhaps 3 minutes. His fuel gauge now showed critically low, the needle resting on empty, though he knew the P-40 had a small reserve. Maybe 5 minutes of flight time. Maybe less. His engine was running rough, cylinders misfiring, oil pressure in the red. But the aircraft was still flying, and he was still alive. At 1,104 hours, Scott spotted his salvation, a small British auxiliary airfield at Bassein, an emergency strip carved out of a rice paddy 40 miles west of Rangoon. It wasn't his home base, but it had a runway, and that was all that mattered. He pushed the throttle forward one last time, praying the engine wouldn't quit. The Ellison responded, coughing and sputtering but delivering power. The airspeed crept up 200, 220, 240 miles per hour. Every second carried him closer to safety. But the Japanese weren't finished. At 1,107 hours, the radio miraculously still partially functional crackled to life with a transmission from Basine Tower. Unidentified P-40, this is Basine Tower. We have you visual. Be advised, enemy fighters in pursuit approximately 3 miles behind you. We're clearing the runway. Land immediately. Scott looked over his shoulder. 8 more Zeros, fresh from Rangoon, had picked up his trail. They were closing fast, and he had no ammunition, no altitude, and virtually no fuel. The race was on. Basine Airfield grew larger in his windscreen, a single dirt runway, perhaps 3,000 feet long, with sandbag revetments and a few support buildings. He could see British and Indian ground crews scrambling to clear the runway, trucks racing out of his path. The Zeros opened fire at 1,109 hours at maximum range. Tracers reached out toward him, falling short by mere yards. They were closing 500 yards, 400, 300. Scott dropped his landing gear. The hydraulic system was damaged and only one main gear locked down properly. The other hung at an angle, partially extended. No time to fix it. No time for anything except to get on the ground before the Zeros cut him to pieces. He crossed the airfield threshold at 140 miles per hour, much too fast, with the Zeros just 200 yards behind him. The British had positioned 2 Bofors anti-aircraft guns at the end of the runway, and as Scott passed overhead, they opened fire over his head at the pursuing Japanese fighters. The effect was immediate. The lead Zero, caught completely by surprise, flew directly into a 40mm shell and exploded spectacularly. The remaining 7 scattered, breaking off their attack as more anti-aircraft fire erupted from positions around the airfield. Scott's P-40 hit the runway hard. The good landing gear absorbed the impact, but the damaged gear collapsed immediately. The right wing dropped, digging into the dirt, and the aircraft began a violent ground loop. Metal shrieked as the wing tore away. The propeller struck the ground and shattered, sending blade fragments spinning through the air. The P-40 skidded sideways for 200 feet and flipped onto its back, sliding inverted for another 100 feet before finally coming to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. Then the canopy exploded outward, blown free by the emergency release. Bob Scott crawled out, covered in hydraulic fluid and blood from a dozen small cuts, but alive. He rolled clear of the aircraft just as the engine caught fire, flames licking up from the cowling British ground. Crew rushed forward with fire extinguishers, dousing the flames before they could reach the fuel tanks. Others grabbed Scott, dragging him toward a nearby bunker as the 7 remaining circled overhead, looking for an opportunity to strafe but deterred by the intense anti-aircraft fire in the bunker. Scott collapsed against the sandbag wall, his hands shaking uncontrollably from adrenaline. A British medical officer pressed a canteen of water into his hands. "How long were you up there?" the officer asked, his voice thick with a Scottish accent. Scott looked at his watch. It had stopped. The crystal cracked. The hands frozen at 1,109 hours. He'd taken off at 0830. 2 hours and 30 to 9 minutes, he whispered. 60 minutes of it with every Jap in Burma trying to kill me. The medical officer stared at him. That's not possible. No one could survive that. But Bob Scott had. The full extent of Scott's ordeal became clear in the hours that followed. Intelligence officers debriefing him pieced together the incredible story from radar tracks, radio intercepts, and eyewitness accounts from the ground. At the battle's peak, Japanese command had diverted between 80 and 90 fighters from the Rangoon raid to hunt down the single American pilot. Some estimates placed the number even higher, possibly exceeding 100 aircraft, dedicated solely to his destruction. It represented the largest concentration of air power ever directed at a single pilot in the history of aerial warfare up to that point. Scott's P-40B was a total loss. Ground crew counted 173 bullet and cannon shell holes in the airframe. The engine had 3 cylinders completely destroyed. The control surfaces were so riddled, with holes that engineers later calculated he'd been flying with less than 40% control authority. One shell had passed within 6 inches of his seat. Had it struck just slightly to the left, it would have killed him instantly. Against impossible odds, he had survived 61 minutes of continuous combat, downed 2 confirmed Japanese fighters, and evaded the largest aerial manhunt of the war. He had done it with skill, courage, and an instinct for survival that bordered on supernatural. The Flying Tigers officially credited him with 2 aerial victories that day, bringing his total to 5, making him an ace. But those numbers didn't capture the full story. He had tied down nearly a third of the Japanese attacking force, fighters that couldn't participate in the Rangoon raid because they were hunting him. The distraction may have saved dozens of Allied lives on the ground. The British commander Bassein recommended Scott for the Distinguished Flying Cross, though the award process was complicated by his status as an AVG volunteer, rather than official U.S. military personnel. Claire Chennault personally commended him in the Flying Tigers daily briefing, calling his survival the most extraordinary display of airmanship and courage I have witnessed in my career. But perhaps the greatest testament came from his fellow pilots. When Scott finally returned to Mingaladon 3 days later, after the battle had ended and the Japanese had withdrawn, his squadron mates lined up on the runway to greet him. They'd repainted one of the spare P-40s with his personal markings and his name on the fuselage. Beneath it, they added a new inscription, the Unkillable. Scott would fly 27 more combat missions with the Flying Tigers before the unit was disbanded in July 1942 and absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group. He survived the war, returning home with 12 confirmed victories and a reputation as one of the finest combat pilots of his generation. In later interviews, Scott was always reluctant to discuss the events of January 23, 1942. When pressed, he would only say, "I got lucky." That's all it was, luck and a tough airplane. But those who studied the engagement knew better. Luck might keep you alive for 5 minutes. It might help you evade a single attacker. But surviving 61 minutes against overwhelming odds required something far beyond luck. It required skill honed to perfection, split-second decision-making under unimaginable pressure, and courage that refused to accept defeat even when death seemed certain. The wreckage of Scott's P-40 Billions was later recovered by the British and studied extensively. Pieces of it were eventually sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where they remain today, a testament to American engineering and the indomitable will of the men who flew these aircraft into combat. The dogfight over Burma on January 23, 1942, stands as one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. A single pilot against impossible odds, refusing to surrender, refusing to die, fighting his way through a gauntlet that should have been his death sentence. Bob Scott's 60-minute miracle reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual courage can triumph over overwhelming force. His story is just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.